Hey everybody, really excited to get started with week 2 on our Effects in Violin series. This week we're going to be talking about EQ. Now when I talk about our Effects on Violin series, we're doing a series of videos right now where we're going to hit a different effect each week. And every week for that given effect, we'll talk about general information. What is that effect? What does it do? What are some common parameters on that effect to help you adjust it and make it sound like you want it to sound? And then what are some examples of uses for strings like violins, violas, cellos? How would we use that effect to make our instrument sound the way we want it to sound? In week 1, we talked about gain structure, which is technically not an effect, but it's like the way your effects are set up. It's really important. It ensures that you've got full dynamic range and tone throughout your signal chain, and it's going to help you make sure that whatever you do past that, it's going to sound the way you want it to sound. If you don't do gain structure right, it doesn't matter what else you do. This week, we're talking about EQ. Now, where gain structure refers to our entire signal strength, EQ is talking about pieces of that signal. We'll talk about the strength of the signal in each frequency range, and that will all make sense, I promise. So in order to understand this, we have to do a little bit of science. We'll try to keep it simple. It's not going to be like an advanced physics class. But if you understand the science behind what you're doing, then I won't get that question that says, what are the EQ settings I need to use for my violin? The answer is, it depends. And if we can help you understand the why, then you will know how to do the what, okay? So one of the first things we want to do is compare light to sound. I know you're like, light and sound, okay, those are different. Well, they are, but we are able to perceive a range of frequencies of light, and we use our eyes to do that. And their different frequencies appear to us as different colors. They're actually not different colors, but we perceive them that way, okay? Low frequencies we perceive as red. High frequencies we perceive as violet. And if we look at the light spectrum here, you can see that as the frequency goes up, the color changes, and there's not anything that's just a perception issue. That is how we perceive those frequencies. Well, audio is very much the same way. We can perceive sonic frequencies with our ears between 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz when we're born. Those of us that have been playing on loud rock stages most of our careers, we cannot hear 20K, not at all. So we can perceive the original audio frequency range for your body. The design parameters are 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, 20,000 hertz. And what that means is we have a lot of words for colors, right? Red and chartreuse, and, you know, as guys, we don't know that many of them, but tan, you know, all these different words, right? For sounds, or colors. We don't have that many words for sounds. Think about that. How many words do you know that really describe sound that are specific to sound? We don't have any. So we use shapes and colors and textures, and it makes it a little difficult sometimes to communicate what we're trying to say when it comes to sound. So here's a little chart that I found on the internet. I think it's a little bit helpful to help us understand in certain frequency ranges, these are the words that we use to describe these frequencies. And you'll see there's a column called description, and there's a column called caution. Every one of these things is a double-edged sword. So if I say in that low frequency range, I want something punchy. Oh yeah, I want punchy. Punchy's good. But if I get too much of that, then it gets into rumble, and that would be bad, right? In this one here, number 6, around 1K, yeah, I've got attack. I've got some whack in there. I've got some, those are good things, but I have to be cautious because that's also the frequency where things can kind of start sounding a little bit nasal. Right? So you can pause and you can screenshot this or whatever. This might be a helpful chart for you. Now, another thing we've got to understand is very common for us to look at EQ, to try to visualize EQ by using a graph that shows frequency versus amplitude. And you'll see this graph here, other way, whoops. This graph right here is probably a familiar looking graph to you, and we'll talk about how to interpret that graph and what that means. Frequency is, we'll call that pitch, and it's measured in hertz. So a low frequency would be a low pitch. Something way down there. I don't have a deep voice. Something way down there would be a low frequency. And then the wee, the real high, the squeaky stuff would be a high frequency. And so there's a measured in hertz. 20 hertz would be a very, very, very low sound. You're really feeling that as much as you're hearing it. And say 10K would be a really, really high squeal. Another thing to keep in mind is a 2-to-1 relationship is called an octave. So when we say with a violin that open A is 440 hertz, the A on the G string, an octave below that would be 220 hertz. Third finger on the A string, the A above that open A would be 880 hertz. This is a good thing to remember in your mind that 2-to-1 relationship, that's an octave. Every time we go up an octave, we double the frequency. If we go down an octave, we cut the frequency in half. For amplitude, which is strength of signal or loudness, and that word's a little problematic, but the strength of the signal is measured in decibels. And the thing to remember about decibels is that they are logarithmic. 50 dB is twice as much sound power as 40 dB. Now, we wouldn't say, it's a little problematic to say loud because our perception of sound is not very scientific, it turns out. But 50 dB is twice as much sound power as 40 dB. So we're like however many charts into this thing. What exactly is EQ? EQ is changing the amplitude or the strength of a frequency or pitch or range of frequencies. So we're going to change the amplitude of a frequency or a range of frequencies, which means if I've got some high frequencies, maybe I want those louder or quieter. Low frequencies, mid frequencies, all those things, I can sculpt my tone by using EQ, and it is really, really powerful. So what are some of the tools in EQ? The first one that we're always going to talk about is the low cut or the HPF, high pass filter, or the high cut, which is conversely the low pass filter. Low cut is when we're cutting low frequencies, which means we're allowing high frequencies to pass. So low cut or high pass, those are the same thing. You'll hear people use those interchangeably. And then high cut, we're cutting high frequencies, which means we're allowing low frequencies to pass. And so high cut or low pass will be used interchangeably. And then there are bell filters. I'm very proud of this. My family invented this. No, we didn't. The bell filter is called a bell filter because it's shaped like a bell, and I'll show you this. And then there is a shelf filter that I'll show you an example of this. So this is what a high cut looks like, or a high pass and a low cut. Those are what they look like on the frequency spectrum. And you can see it's not a brick wall, it's a roll off. So if I set my high pass at 200 hertz, it means that it's rolling off at a nominal frequency of 200 hertz. I may be getting a little bit into the 220, but I'm not completely cutting out even 150. It's a roll off. And then the same thing on the high end. It's a roll off of those frequencies. This is what the bell filter looks like, and you can see why it's called a bell filter. And this would be, and we can adjust the width on these on certain EQs. So this is a wide cut. This is where we'd be pulling a lot of frequencies out. We're kind of making a little dish there right around 1K. And then this would be something more surgical. This would be a narrow filter or a higher Q. And this is where we're trying to get more specific. Say we've got a frequency that's feeding back. We've got one specific frequency that's giving us a problem, and we would use a narrow filter to go after that. And then the other thing, which you'll sometimes see, is a shelf, like a low shelf. I'm showing a low boost here, and I'm showing a high cut. And that would be that we've taken all the, there's sort of a ramp up to our given frequency, but then below or above that, it's kind of, we've boosted that. And this would be like if I want to put some more bass in my mix, but I want a lot more bass in my mix. So I might put a low shelf boost on there, and it's going to boost every frequency below the one that I set it. Or if I've got a high shelf cut, boy, this thing is pretty tinny and pretty sparkly, a little too sparkly for me. So we might cut every frequency above a certain one. And these, as you can see, they're a little different than a roll-off, okay? The question you might be asking, okay, I'm looking at a parametric EQ, but I don't have a parametric EQ on my pedal board. I've got this graphic EQ. The Boss GE7 is a really popular pedal. What is this thing doing? Well, those 7 things are basically 7 bell filters that are set fairly narrow. So this is kind of what we would be seeing if we boosted the 800 and cut the 400. That's about what you'd be seeing the effect that you'd be having with that pedal. So you got to understand that every one of these EQ filters, the way they work, we won't get into the science, but it's always going to be a bell filter like this. We can adjust the width on it with a parametric. They're set on a graphic EQ, but that's what's going on. Now, general principles. What are some general principles for EQ? EQ, I like to joke, is like voting. You want to do it early and often. And that's it. Okay, don't vote more than once, unless you're in your HOA or something. Then yeah, do it all you want. But yes, you want to EQ early and often. So you want to EQ pretty early in your chain. And then a lot of your effects pedals are going to have some EQ built into them. Sometimes they'll call it tone. Sometimes they'll call it roll off. But you're going to want to do some EQing with pretty much each one of your effects, because your violin or your viola or your cello is making certain sounds, and we want to sculpt that sound before we feed it to the first pedal. And then that pedal is going to generate other frequencies, and we may want to tame or boost those frequencies within the pedal before we get to the next one. So we're going to EQ early and often. You want to use it before an effect to make sure you've got the right frequencies going into that effect, so it's going to do what you want it to do. And then you want to use it after the effect, because sometimes those effects will generate weird artifacts. We might want to get rid of those. Or maybe it's going to generate a tone we really like and we want more of that. Okay? I will say there's some audio examples that you're going to hear of all these things on a separate video, and I'm going to put a link to that in just a second. But general principles, one of the first things I want to do as a sound engineer is I want to high pass that signal as high as possible, which means low cut. I want to cut out as many low frequencies as I can. The way I do that is I engage my high pass filter. I run up the frequency until I hear it starting to make my tone kind of tinny. Like I can hear it starting to bite into the bottom of my tone, and then I'll back it off just a little bit. So we want to high pass as much as we can. And in this next video that we'll link to in a second, we will talk about why that is. The next thing, we always want to cut unwanted frequencies. Subtractive EQ is it's preferred over additive EQ. It's preferential, is that the word? So we want to cut first and boost last. Always cut if you can. And you're like, what, I want more mids. Well, one way to get more mids is to cut the lows and cut the highs. And that's what leaves your mids in the middle. And what it does is has the effect of boosting your mids. But when we're adding, sometimes things can get a little messy. Timothy and I will talk about that in a second. But cut if you can, boost only when you must. Use reference recordings. If you have a recording of somebody playing an instrument similar to yours and you really like the overall sound of that instrument, listen to that recording and then play your instrument and let your ears sort of say, wow, that one has a lot more bottom end in it. So now I need to figure out how to get more bottom end in mine. Or that one is sparklier than mine. I've got to figure out how to get some sparkle into mine. Because your ears are very, very easy to fool. If you're not using reference recordings, you can end up chasing ghosts. Look at an RTA if you have one. An RTA is a real-time analyzer. You can get one on your phone. And what it will do is it will show you a real-time frequency plot where it's frequency on one axis and amplitude on the other, just like the EQ chart that we showed. And it will show you in real time the frequencies that you're generating. You go, oh, wow, I really got a big spike here at about 4K. Well, that's going to allow you to see things that your ears haven't really figured out how to hear yet. So you'll train your ears how to hear different frequencies and just experiment. One of the things you can do is you go, well, what would happen if I cut 400 hertz? Well, do it. Cut 400 hertz and see what it sounds like. Experiment, train your ears, and then learn how to trust them. So I mentioned that we're going to have a chat with Timothy Huh. He is a live studio player. He's a live player and a studio player. Studio and live player. Live studio player. Oh, studio live player. Fantastic guy. Years of experience with gain, EQ, compression. There's going to be a bunch of audio examples in here. And I'm going to post a link to that video right here so you can link to that. And because it's a separate video, we go for, I don't know, about 25 minutes talking about a lot of really cool stuff. And there are a bunch of audio examples in that video so you can hear what happens when I say run up the low pass or run up your high pass filter. What does that sound like? Well, you'll hear it in that video. Then I would be remiss if I didn't talk about this one last thing. Most electric string instruments use piezo pickups. And a known issue with piezos, it's the thing that people complain about with piezos, is the dreaded quack, that piezo quack. It's just got that sound to it. And how do we tame that quack? That quack is between 2.5 kilohertz and 5 kilohertz. It does vary based on which piezo they're using and how it's built into the instrument. But it's generally, there's going to be sort of a quack between about 2.5 and 5 kilohertz. And you can cut that frequency pretty aggressively. And still, as long as you're doing with a fairly narrow cut, you're going to pull a lot of that quack out of the instrument. And you're going to go, oh, thank God, now it actually sounds like an instrument that I want to play. So hopefully that has given you some fundamental ideas about what's going on with EQ. If you want to hear more audio examples, definitely recommend clicking on that link to the discussion with Timothy Huh. As always, mash that subscribe button, check out some other videos we've got, and I will see you guys next week when we talk about another effect.